We are talking to you today about the elections in the United States of America. Some call it a landslide victory for Donald Trump, although the latest polls that took place just the day before had the candidates running neck and neck. But this morning, Kyiv time, the world looks very different, and Donald Trump and the Republican Party are likely to win a significant and truly historic victory. I'd like to start with your feelings, your experience. What are the main challenges? What details do you see in what is happening right now before our eyes? Of course, we see a complete victory not only for Donald Trump, but for the Republican Party. If we look at the Senate and the House of Representatives, where Republicans are winning in both houses of the U.S. Congress, Trump is likely to win the presidential campaign. First of all, I see in this victory the desire of a significant part of American society to significantly change the current world order, in the sense that, we constantly say that Russia, for example, wants to change it. But the problem is that this world order that has developed now is far from working for the power of the West as it used to. And the best example of this is the behavior of the UN Secretary General, who comes to the BRICS summit in Russia, which is organized by countries that he considers to be the most important anti-Western forces, while ignoring the peace summit organized by Ukraine in Switzerland, making it clear that he is on the other side. Why? Because he believes that the United States is no longer a power, but that other countries are. And many people in America realize that this behavior, which has been in place since the beginning of Barack Obama's administration, which is 2008, and then Obama's 2 terms and Biden's term, which is practically 3 terms of this policy, is leading to the United States losing ground rather than gaining ground. You know how Mikhailo Honchar joked on Facebook this morning that the United States of America did not want Barack Obama's 4th term, hinting that this would be a continuation of this line. That is, there is a demand for a radical modernization, a shake-up of world institutions, so to speak, in order to restore the dominant role of the West, so as not to say that we should somehow be reconciled. We need to look for some kind of dialogue. By and large, for me, this is a clear signal that, the era of the Chamberlains is not in time. The era of the Churchills is more needed. And it is in this result that Trump and the Republican Party have received that I see a request for a radical change in the current state of affairs so that the United States is ready to take tough steps. That would help strengthen this country, that would disrupt the world order. A good expression is that dictators have hacked the modern world order, and now the system that was built to counteract this dictator is now practically working in their favor. So we see that Russia remains in the UN Security Council. And the Iranian representative is the head of the UN Human Rights Council. And Iran and human rights are not exactly identical things. We see that these are the realities of the world. And the preservation of the Democratic Party in power is a search for the possibility of coexistence in these realities. And Trump is primarily a request for a strong hand. Yesterday, I had the opportunity to talk to my colleagues from the Polish Vystrad Insight Institute, and we were discussing these trends just before the election. And representatives from Slovakia said that there is not so much sympathy for Trump now, but rather a desire for more authoritarianism in many countries. And that is why Orban and others are so welcoming of Trump, because they like him so much, because they see that there is a demand for authoritarianism now, and Trump embodies it. But we'll see what happens next, because I've said it before and I'm saying it again now that there are three big lies: before the election, during the war, and after the hunt. What was said before the election and what comes after them are sometimes very different things. Mr. Ivan, I have another question that concerns the statements that Donald Trump has already made during his victory speech, as he sometimes calls it, and which already seems to be a fait accompli for the Republicans, that he promises to end the wars. We don't have any details, but we can assume for now that it is the Russian-Ukrainian war, which Donald Trump has repeatedly commented on, and it is also the conflict in the Middle East, which also requires assistance from the United States, defense packages, and financial support for Israel. And do you think Donald Trump would be able to really end the wars and conflicts that he commented on during his election campaign? I doubt very much that he will easily be able to fulfill this promise, that he will quickly end all wars. And what he said in his speech, that is, he has already said that I am not going to start wars, I will end them. But this is, a classic expression that politicians love to use, and if you remind them of this expression in 2 years, they may deny it. But this is the reality of life. When any politician always makes a lot of statements in the wake of his victory, but then finds out that it is not so easy to fulfill them. All these promises. Because to end these wars, direct U.S. intervention is needed. Whether it will be, I'm not sure. This is such a very important point. Why? Because we still see that the United States of America avoids an active role. Avoid being a more involved player in this war, which concerns both Ukraine and the Middle East. But again, let's see how much the policy can hypothetically change. First of all, let's not forget that until January 20th, the U.S. President, Joseph Biden, is in office, and I'm not ruling out that Ukraine may have a good window of opportunity. Under which Joseph Biden has reserved $6 to $8 billion to help Ukraine, so that Ukraine can actually get better weapons. And the most important thing that was said in terms of victory for Ukraine is that Ukraine should receive not only weapons from warehouses, but also live weapons. Because after all, if the world's leading arms companies want to test their weapons somewhere, Ukraine is the best option. Before that, we cannot say that we felt such a desire to test new weapons in Ukraine, but we will see what happens in this period until January 20th. And of course, how things will develop after Trump's inauguration, what kind of cabinet he will have, who will make decisions. But I emphasize that we will live until January 20th, during the Biden era. I hope that Biden will write his name in history as a person who will lay the foundations for improving Ukraine's position. The rest will follow. The only thing is that, to repeat myself, I doubt very much about Trump's statement that he will end the wars. Because in order to end them, we need a more active role of America and the U.S. military itself in Ukraine and in the Middle East. And I am not sure that the United States in its current form is capable of this. The era of FDR and Reagan, even Bush the Younger, who sent American troops first to Afghanistan, then to Iraq, is in my opinion over. And we have not yet seen a politician in the United States who would make a similar decision. While the world keeps its faces and eyes fixed on screens, whether smartphones or TVs, as we watch the U.S. presidential election, we have other threats that are growing for the civilized world, including the formation of the so-called axis of evil, which includes Russia, Iran, and the DPRK, which is increasing its capabilities. And in fact, on November 6th, Chief Alexander Syrsky also said that Russia is engaging DPRK troops to retake the Kursk region, where I would remind you that the Ukrainian armed forces have been operating since August 6. Donald Trump's relations with North Korea during his presidency are quite ambiguous, let's call them that. He tried to meet with the leader of North Korea. But still, it was more often about nuclear threats from both sides. And I want to quote Donald Trump's post from January 3rd, 2018, during his presidency. And I quote, "North Korean leader Kim Jong-un has said that the nuclear button is always on his desk. Can someone from his exhausted and hungry regime tell him that I also have a nuclear button, but it is much bigger and more powerful than his, and my button works?" Of course, we cannot predict Donald Trump's potential role, but in general, we cannot assess his role in breaking this so-called axis of evil, given the fact that the DPRK was constantly criticized, sanctions were imposed on Iran, and this was actively happening during Trump's presidency. Of course, Trump, in my opinion, can be more active in countering this modern axis of evil, and here it is important to explain to him that Russia is part of this axis. That is, when Trump has repeatedly spoken out and taken significant actions against Iran, let's remember Soleimani, and Soleimani's assassination was done, as they say, on Trump's direct instructions. I should add that Russia is not your potential ally in this struggle. On the contrary, Russia is part of this axis of evil. And in general, when I was talking about the attitude of both candidates towards Ukraine before this election, I always like to say that, look, let's compare the situation with playing cards, where red means maintaining support, black means decreasing support. And if you divide the cards between two players, between Kamala Harris and Donald Trump, Kamala Harris certainly has more red cards in her hand, meaning maintaining support, while Trump has more black cards. But as in any standard card game, there is a joker card, which in this case is the victory of Ukraine. And this card is in the hands of Donald Trump. Why? Because after all, the Democrats set certain limits on their support, and there was no sense that they were ready to do everything for Ukraine's victory. As for Trump, on the one hand, it seems that he is more willing to cooperate with Russia, but whether he actually implements it, whether he actually lifts the sanctions, or whether he strengthens the sanctions even more, he will contribute to a significant drop in oil prices, which he has promised repeatedly that the first thing he will do is drill there. If he takes steps that the Democrats could not take, such as the proposal from the head of the private military company Blackwaters, the largest in the United States, that they are ready to forcefully change the government in Venezuela to a regime loyal to the U.S., which will return Venezuela to the global economy. And Venezuela is the largest country in the world in terms of proven oil deposits. And if Maduro is replaced by someone more American-oriented, and U.S. oil service companies start to contribute to the development of the oil industry in this country, I think prices will fall. And if you add to this the promises of Saudi Arabia, whose relations with the United States were not the best during the democratic era, because the Crown Prince could not be forgiven for Khashoggi's murder, and under Trump I don't think he will take Khashoggi's murder into account. That is, he will go to improve relations with this country. It is quite possible that Trump's main achievement that will directly affect Russia's war against Ukraine. I remind you that according to the draft budget of Russia for the next year, 73% of revenues may come from oil and hydrocarbons. That is, if Russia does not receive significant money, and if the world price is 50 to the Russian price of 45, because there is a discount, and if the price is 45 instead of 69.5, Russia will have much less opportunity to wage war. The other question is how well it will be possible to realize this. Again, while we are discussing expectations, life itself will show how well these expectations will materialize. Mr. Ivan, we have talked about what will happen to the so-called axis of evil, and I would like us to also assess the axis of Donald Trump, given who within the United States of America has supported him and who represents his team. First of all, potential Vice President J.D. Vance, who is famous, among other things, for his criticism of Ukraine and his criticism of our country's actions against the pro-Russian UOCO. The Moscow Patriarchate, he called it a restriction of religious freedom and so on, said that support for Ukraine should be reduced. And finally, Elon Musk, an entrepreneur, inventor, and billionaire, also expressed significant support for Donald Trump. And sometimes this resulted in a huge confrontation on social media, not so much with Donald Trump, but with the team that also, which in particular, will also come to power in the United States. Of course, we will now see who it will be. As for J.D. Vance, the vice president, he has spoken out against Ukraine in a significant way. But we need to look for ways to reach him. And by and large, as they say, it is not that difficult to do, because J.D. Vance is significantly, not that he depends on him, but he is influenced by the American billionaire Thiel, who has business interests in Ukraine. And I think it is through Thiel that we can reach J.D. Vance and say, listen, what you said, of course, was before the election, and now the election is over. So let's get back to the reality, where America's greatness is largely based on whether Ukraine wins or not. Because if Ukraine loses, it will be a victory for your opponents, which will not help improve your country's positioning. On the contrary, it will emphasize that America is still losing. That's why we can work with J.D. Vance through Thiel. As for other representatives of the Republican Party who have been critical of Ukraine, we need to look for ways to reach them and also look at all these positions. Because the first thing that interests me in a hypothetical new, let's say, cabinet, this is not quite the right expression, but in the leadership of the United States of America, this is a potential role for Nikki Haley, a person who really supports Ukraine, who was Trump's main competitor in the internal party elections when she was the one Trump defeated to become president. And now, in order to maintain the support of the entire Republican Party, I do not exclude that Trump will need to somehow accommodate Nikki Haley. And as an option, I do not exclude that Nikki Haley may be the person who will be in charge of the Ukrainian direction, which will certainly be a plus for Ukraine, as well as the fact that this direction will be handled by another person who already has experience representing in Ukraine, namely Kurt Volker. And it is also possible that he will not return to power in the context of Ukraine. Or perhaps it will be some specific, extraordinary steps that are difficult to predict, that is, finding some position for a non-U.S. citizen. Former British Prime Minister Boris Johnson, who has always supported Trump. There are also options for people who understand the need for Ukraine's victory, who have interesting ideas, like Boris Johnson, who said that if the U.S. wants to withdraw its troops from Europe, he has a proposal. Take Ukraine into NATO, and the Ukrainian military can replace the U.S. after Ukraine's victory. The only thing that is needed is for this victory to happen. So here the United States must help Ukraine win the war. After that, Ukraine must commit to keeping its military in the places where the U.S. military is deployed and in Europe, and to releasing them accordingly. It's a complicated scheme, but in principle, since it should bring us victory in the war, it is a priori interesting to us. Then, of course, we will see what other appointments will be made, how people from the inner circle will behave, especially those who criticized Ukraine very strongly, those who said that Ukraine eats too much money. But, populists already have a good habit. You can say one thing, then the next morning say the opposite thing, and nothing will happen, because that's your style. And the same thing can happen with all these Trumpists, who were very much against Ukraine, that at one point they may forget all their previous words and start saying the opposite. I would not be surprised if this happens. Let's see, we have time until January 20th, and from January 20, we will look at the realities. We will listen to what Ukrainians have to say and hope that critical decisions for Ukraine will be made, but only time will tell us more. Thank you, Mr. Ivan, for traditionally finding time for our broadcasts. Ivan Us, Chief Consultant at the National Institute for Strategic Studies, was on the line with us. We talked about the elections in the United States together.